Time is of the essence, pathways to enhance fair and resilient trade. That's the title of our panel this afternoon. And we spent the morning today, as you all well know, hearing the messages that all of us in this room, many of us, already know. We already know, for example, of the opportunities of living and working in this region with 1.5 billion up-and-coming middle-class citizens. We know the $1.5 trillion of trade with the U.S. that's already happening. We know that American businesses in this region contribute millions of jobs back to Americans in the U.S. We know of the challenge of competing against China and others and having missed the boat on TPP and now staring down the barrel of RCEP. We know that the U.S. government is pledging to upgrade and update its engagement on several levels. We also know that President Biden will be in Tokyo next week to unveil the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But we also know that our opportunities are now, and we need to move faster than the government, frankly, is able to move. So this brings us to our panel today. Time is of the essence, pathways to enhance fair and resilient trade. How do we get there? Over the next 36 minutes and 29 seconds, we will look at pathways and how we can get there as fast as possible. I'm very pleased to join the panel today. My name is Glenn Van Zutphen, and you, of course, know Charles and Steve from earlier today. And also, I'd like to reintroduce Virginia Foote, President and CEO of Global Bay Strategies, and Lydia Ruddy, Special Advisor to the President, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN. Welcome to all of you today, and thanks to all of you. And before you get too comfortable, the only time slot that's a little less favorable than just before lunch is the one that's after lunch on a Friday at a conference when everybody wants to get away. So we hope that you will stay engaged. We are going to be opening the floor for questions, so please, we want to have a more interactive dialogue, quite frankly, to make sure that everybody stays awake for the next 35 minutes and 34 seconds. So please think about your questions in relation to this topic. I'd like to start off first by just getting a few opening comments. Let's go ahead and start with you, Lydia, on this topic of how can we get things moving fast? Sure. Or you want to use that? Either way.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
And I'm very,
a little bit closer.
I'm very happy to be here today. This is the first time I've been to this summit, and it's a real pleasure to be on this panel. I'm from the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, which probably maybe two people in this room have heard of before just now. What we do, we were set up by the East Asia Summit to provide research for the governments of ASEAN. We cover the whole region. We cover a whole bunch of different topics. We were originally a bunch of economists looking at mostly trade and regional integration, but in the last couple of years, we've expanded to cover a lot of energy projects, environment, climate change. We have a big marine plastic debris program, which has a private sector platform that will allow you to put in, if any of you happen to have any marine plastic debris projects, we would really love to know what they are. And it's a clearinghouse of information. We're also now expanding into health for obvious post-COVID reasons. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, first of all, the topic of this session refers to the fair and resilient trade. Now, okay, I've been working for a trade organization for 5 years, and I have to admit, I was like, resilient trade? I know resilient supply chains, but I did not know what resilient trade was. So what it is actually the first pillar of the IPEF. That's where that term comes up. And this is the pillar that's covered by USTR. And it covers a whole bunch of different sections. And so I don't know, you can ask questions on the other sections. There's labor, there's environment, but I decided I would focus down onto a little bit about the e-commerce in the region. Now, perhaps that's because I'm in Indonesia, which is the land of unicorns for e-commerce. We have Tokopedia and Gojek, and these two have just merged, and these are huge, huge companies. So one of the things that we do at ERIE, that's the short word for my organization, is provide policy briefs to government. And so this is loosely based on a policy brief that was written. I'm going to go super fast, so you're not going to be falling asleep in the post-lunch session. So the importance of e-commerce. In ASEAN, forecasts are 360 billion by 2025 of e-commerce trade. Globally, internet retailers have grown 327% between 2017 and 2021. I myself, and I suspect a lot of you in the room, have become e-commerce converts as a result of the pandemic. It's just really been a boost to the entire industry. So the opportunities in this region are huge, and there are, of course, the challenges. I'm going to list a couple of them because I think as business people, opportunities are in the challenges often. So number one, physical infrastructure. Overall, ASEAN's infrastructure for e-commerce is good relative to other regions, but when it comes to ICT, it's really fragmented. So between countries, big differences, and even within countries, like Indonesia, for example, it's a very fragmented ICT. Then we have the logistics issue, which is really a problem, especially in places like Indonesia. The last mile, I mean, getting things, if you want to order something from Amazon in Indonesia, just forget about it. I tell all my friends, send it to Singapore, I'll go pick it up. Luckily, I have friends in Singapore. Yeah, it's really a challenge. Regional rule setting, this has already been covered a little bit, but data governance, there's no common position on regulating cross-border data flows, privacy protection, consumer protection, data localization. Indonesia did just clean up its act a bit on the data localization. Well, they had help because actually the big e-commerce and digital companies have created their own data centers in the country. Then there needs to be more emphasis on fair competition, creating a digital environment for fair competition with the free movement and accuracy of information and fairness in access to information, protection of consumers and producers, and security of payments, which has also been addressed. New technologies that can improve smartphone economy. Now, I'm sure it's the same in other parts of ASEAN, but Indonesia, everyone's doing everything on the smartphone. And I'm old-fashioned, and I don't know what's happened, I've been gone from the United States for 15 years now, but everyone's always sending me documents on my phone. I cannot. I have to send it to myself and email them just so that I can open it on a bigger screen. So we need new apps in this section. We need internet financial innovation. Lastly, digital inclusion. This is especially to address the gender divide, and then young entrepreneurs, vulnerable or marginalized groups, and MSMEs. So many of these issues have already been addressed in something you may never have heard of called the ASEAN Agreement on E-Commerce, which came into effect at the end of last year. In addition to those issues, they have stated that each member state will expand e-trade, recognize electronic signatures and authentication, and personal information protection. So progress is being made at the regional level, and it's a matter of time until it comes down to the national levels. So that's e-commerce in a big picture. There's a lot of opportunities there. I think come back to the question of, I think, implementation.
Yep, let's come back to that. Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Lydia. Ginny, on to you.
Great, thank you, Glenn. I wanted to talk more as AmCham than my business hat. But I think one of the things, and what Steve was saying at the last discussion. I think that we as AmChams scattered around the region should maybe be in more touch than we have been on some of these issues of what we call hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, either regulatory or new laws that are happening in each of our individual countries. Because obviously enhanced and fair and resilient trade affects our individual companies and individual countries, but so much of this is regional. And I know AmCham here, we are constantly looking at draft laws on digital or e-commerce or cross-border data flows or data localization or tax or blah, 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 which all of us are dealing with in maybe slightly different ways in the various countries where we're posted and doing business. But I think for us, that the two sort of buckets for this are hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, and trying to get some sort of harmonization across the region, global standards. All of this, I think, is part of APEC and hopefully part of IPEF. But to the extent that what you all are pushing Indonesia to do, what we are asking the government of Vietnam to do, it helps that these are standards and procedures that we see as being beneficial, across the region. On trade for Vietnam, as was discussed briefly this morning, we came to the edge of a cliff on the trade deficit issue and on Washington wanting to impose punitive tariffs on Vietnam because the trade deficit had gotten so big. And I think this is a problem, actually, that's gotten worse during COVID instead of better, surprisingly. Some of it is that Vietnam has been successful in attracting investment, and so a lot of the export from Vietnam to the U.S., which is true for many of the countries in the region, is a result of foreign direct investment. So it's U.S. brands that are buying product in Vietnam to sell to the American consumer. So it's pretty hard to blame Vietnam for the trade deficit in situations like that. But that's not how the numbers read, so too bad. But we are, and I know other chambers are working on this, sometimes the system for exporting is a lot easier than the system for importing. So to bring in pharmaceutical products or other high-end products from the U.S. to Vietnam, we do hit, maybe not technical barriers to trade technically, but often they feel like that, and that foreign direct investment is sometimes viewed as competing with domestic companies. So it's changed a bit over the years. We used to feel we were competing with state-owned enterprises, but now there are very successful, as I know there are in Indonesia as well, domestic companies who would just as soon see U.S. and other big companies stay a bit out of the system while they grow domestically. So I think that is an area where we do find some difficulties and where we are constantly trying to talk about a level playing field is good for us all. And to look at the regulatory framework in terms of business, not FDI versus domestic. The one other point that I wanted to just briefly touch on that really affects trade is the boring topic, but very important topic of tax policy. And somebody this morning mentioned that I think just about all of the countries in the region have a tax agreement with the U.S. It's hugely important for our companies. We're still fighting that battle here. And normally we are complaining to the Vietnamese government about something. Right now we're complaining to our own government in Washington of what on earth is going on negotiations with Vietnam on a tax treaty. So we as AmCham try to make our voice heard and be gnats on people's ankles when we think what the U.S. is doing or not doing also affects our ability to do business. And then one final thing, which I think is not so much regulatory, but is obviously hugely important, are the logistical barriers or the logistical logjam in Asia now. We are having long lead times for containers to come in empty, to be filled. The ports in China are really backed up. So I think that is another something that we as groups of chambers should, I don't know, try to work on. There are not enough deep water ports in Asia, and we are all really jammed up. So that's one on the trade horizon that I think is extremely important to tackle.
Great. Thanks very much. Yes, Steve?
I just want to hop on one point Lydia made, and Lydia knows so much more about digital trade than I do, so I'm not going to touch the substance, but I think the key point to remember, and it's something that MSD on the innovation panel brought up, that we're all digital trade companies. Digital trade is not a subset of the economy. It's the entire economy. And what we need to do, as Ginny was saying, is AmChams, is we need to get behind a digital trade agreement and not just leave it to Google and AWS and Facebook and the like. And it's so important for all the reasons Lydia said. I think that's something that is, I think, a key takeaway from our sessions today.
Cool. Thanks. Charles, this morning you were fairly bearish in your outlook on some of the government action or inaction on various policies. As you look at this idea of resilience, what strikes you as being first, second, third most important elements of that when we look at companies doing business in this region? I know you've touched on a lot of these issues already in the morning sessions, but if we can just maybe hone it down a little bit.
There's no easy answer to that, Glenn, and so I'm not going to answer it. Let me just, if I can pick up on, and I'll try to remember and respond,
No
but I want to pick up on Steve's point, and that's the basic blocking and tackling of moving the U.S. government in particular towards a goal that we all share. And in terms of time is of the essence, that's spot on. If you go to the U.S. Chamber's website and look at our cheat sheet for the IPEF, the first principle is time is of the essence. It truly is. We're falling behind. As a former trade negotiator with USTR in my naive youth, we all believed in this concept that any trade agreement by WTO rules had to cover, any free trade agreement had to cover substantially all trade, and that meant that you had this massive undertaking where individual chapters of the agreement were being negotiated painstakingly by different negotiating teams, and then they'd all kind of circle them together and kick out this final agreement. We're no longer living in the area of principle, and therefore the essential rule that all of us kind of, put under our pillows every night before we went to bed, that you need a comprehensive trade agreement before you can proceed, is probably no more. And in a way, that's oddly liberating because it allows us to push for early harvests on things that are really important. And it's all really important, but are kind of the essence. If you look at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and recognizing that this is not an opportunity for other countries to gain additional market access, at least in the short term, medium term, into the United States, there are some important things we can get done. The digital agreement is first and foremost on that. There is a ton of momentum on it. I agree completely with those who say we're all digital companies and we all have a stake in this. We cannot leave this to the to big tech because, for a variety of reasons, including politically in the United States, having big tech be your champion is probably not the best look. So I would encourage everybody, as you're thinking about door knocks and as you're considering interaction with whatever part of the U.S. government you want to, focus on the near-term early harvest things that we can get done. Beyond that, if you recognize that the United States is limited in its ability to break fresh ground on trade policy and trade laws, there's plenty of existing precedents in U.S. laws and regulations that you can expand on creatively to generate really new and effective and interesting models. You look at the national single window policy or the ASEAN single window. To standardize those processes it would be enormously helpful to exporters and importers. If you look at the AEO, and I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for, but it's essentially the Trusted Partner Program to allow for faster customs clearance. Expanding and building upon the AEO system in the United States, everyone has it. You have it here. That would really kind of generate new opportunities to move the ball forward. So all I'm saying is although we're all burning a candle for TPP, in the absence of that, what can we achieve in the short term? And the short term are these very kind of, some would say narrow, but extremely important pieces. Digital I think is a big piece on its own, but then within the trade agreement, within the other pillars of the IPEF, there are some very significant opportunities to do new things. So, this is going to take creativity, and it's going to take thinking outside the box, and it's going to take a lot of us pushing hard constantly at the squeaky wheel to get it oiled.
Thank you. We do want to take some of your questions in our last 15 minutes or so. Just one quick follow-up question. Do you expect the new ASEAN ambassador, should he be confirmed shortly, to be of help on these issues that you just mentioned?
On the way, and a really good one. Johannes from NSC was named last week, and assuming that confirmation is expeditious, can't ever assume that. But if it does happen, I think he will be both effective and an enormous partner for all of us.
Great. Any questions from the audience? We'd love to get your input or observations, things you've seen, things that have worked for you. Anybody want to be the brave soul to first put your hand up?
Because, I'm the executive director of AmCham Myanmar, and so our trade situation is really precarious, changing, and difficult. I'll just say AEO's authorized economic operators, we tried to set this up, a version of it in Myanmar, and got pretty far, and then the coup happened, and that was a bit unfortunate. So I wish I had a much more thoughtful question, but I just feel like coming from Myanmar, I don't know. Steve, you called me out.
You always ask good ones when we have a virtual door knock.
Yeah, I try to.
Well, thank you for coming, though.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure. We're happy to be here and happy to take your questions on Burma.
I wanted to go back to something that Mike Froman said, actually, because I think when Ginny asked him that question, one of the first things I heard him say is basically like, well, yeah, TPP, it's too bad, but that certainly there's no possibility of that happening. And I know that, and Steve, maybe this is directed to you, because I know that you always hold out hope on TPP. And I'm not asking this because we don't want it. Obviously, all of us want it. But given that the IPEF doesn't have a lot of detail, and given the political reality in the U.S., and this is for all of you, what is the future with this kind of stuff, and when can it change, where the U.S. can actually do something that is going to be meaningful?
The things that we can do is the AmChams. Is the U.S. government always says to us, help us, show us why trade is good for U.S. businesses. And I mean, I don't think Chua's here now, but he was saying, like, there's 100 suppliers, that go into one HP factory. Well, a lot of those suppliers might be in the U.S., but the U.S. government doesn't necessarily know that, and we're not making that case. So I think, Adam, what we need to try and do, and the Chamber has a website and has a page that tries to calculate the jobs that are created by trade. Well, we can do that as our own AmChams. So I think that's one of the things that we need to be doing a better job, is selling the economic benefits of trade in the U.S. in addition to what it means for us in the region.
Lydia, how about you? How do you feel about that? What are the future of these things? We know IPEF is going to be more of a framework than it is a treaty, right? It's not really a treaty. Is that the way forward? Giving a framework, pick the low-hanging fruit, and move on?
Well, for now it is, because precisely this issue.
Yeah.
So I think that what we need is a real campaign. And I was just in DC as well, and I talked with some people there about who is in charge of doing this kind of outreach to the public. And that's a key question.
So what was the answer?
Yeah, no one knows.
No answer, okay.
There is nobody.
Ouch, huh?
So somebody needs to take the lead on this. So why not AmChams? One other quick idea that I've had, I've flipped back and forth between public and private sector. And in terms of getting things off the ground, you see in government they've started bringing in private sector engagement people, but that's a really loose term, and I think they flounder around a bit. What if AmChams created a position, maybe in each country, maybe one overall, that really was focused on IPEF implementation, just to start bringing in the private sector on specific elements of the IPEF. Anyway, it's just a quick idea, and one that I would be interested in following up on. And I, by the way, I forgot to say that I'm also on the board of AmCham Indonesia.
Yeah. Thanks, Lydia. Ginny, any comments on that question from your more local perspective in Vietnam?
Yeah, I think that as we've said, the sort of establishing global standards, whether they are mandatory or just sort of a point of pressure, I think is worth something. Obviously, it's better under the TPP. Here is the rule. You must comply with it by year, whatever. You might get a phase-in or something. I don't see IPEF working that way. APEC hasn't worked that way. But nonetheless, it can establish sort of a global standard that we can all point to. And I do think it's not as good as a commitment to a rule, but I think to the extent we, through this IPEF process, come to some global standards, it's useful. I mean, one of the things that, and everybody has said this, but, digital economy too often in Vietnam is about e-commerce, which is a part of that, of course. But digital transformation, which is the other term we try to use, is like water, electricity, and the air we breathe. You can't do a business without electricity, water, and the air we breathe, and you can't do it without a digital system that is user-friendly and meets all of the various cross-border and data localization and whatnot. So it's really a utility. It's a tool. It's a fundamental piece of any economy and any business, local, small, large, cross-border. It's a hugely important framework, and to get standards, cross-border standards, I think to Charles's point, that is maybe something that could be an early harvest, is to really begin to talk in terms that are more global.
Yeah, but like on digital trade, if you think, right, there's three components to it, right? There's the rules, right? So you need the digital trade agreement, but there's the infrastructure that is, and then there's the capacity building, right? You need to have the government officials who can write the rules, and we can do, as a business community, you can focus on 2 and 3 while you wait for 1. And if you look at, the commitments that came out of the, the special summit with ASEAN, right, $150 million for Southeast Asia. That's, something like $3 for every person in Metro Jakarta, right? It's not going to get us very far, especially when you look at what, our neighbor to the north right now is doing in terms of the money they're putting in to Southeast Asia. And so this is what the U.S. government was saying, that our private sector is going to come in and make up that difference. The private sector is going to be doing all of this investment. And so we do have to be thinking about how we can fit our investment as a private sector in the infrastructure side and in the capacity building side while we push the U.S. government to catch up with us on the rule side.
That's why we need the IPEF implementator.
What was that?
I just said that's why we need the IPEF implementation person who's going to actually focus on these.
Anybody volunteering for that, by the way, in the room? No? Okay. Yeah, Charles.
Adam's gone, but I wanted to just quickly pick up on the question of, why can't we get the TPP done? And you look at public polling on trade in the United States, and the overwhelming majority of Americans now support trade. It goes up and down. Now it's at a very high point. And so you're thinking, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't, given the popularity, why wouldn't you move forward? The reason trade agreements are so terrifying to politicians in Washington is the 30 or 50,000 or so voters in Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, that made the difference in 2016 and are again kind of up for negotiation. And there's been this 20-year vilification of trade as the reason for
Their lives.
Their lives, right? And that's not right. I mean, I'll tell a quick story. I'll try to keep it quick. When I was at USTR back in the dark ages, we had just we were 3 or 4 years into the China accession process, and we were at USTR we were getting beaten up by Congress for all these terrible things that were happening. That there's this giant sucking sound, and look what China is doing to manufacturing employment in the United States. And I'm not too bright, but I can check the math, and it was pretty clear that the sectors in which the United States was losing manufacturing employment and the rise in imports from China were completely different. We're just not in the same even HTS big category, let alone case by case. So I decided, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the U.S. International Trade Commission to do a study looking at the employment effects of trade with China since, in the previous 5 years. And, I arranged this to the ITC to get this study done. I wrote the press release. It went up to the White House, to the OMB, and to the politicals. And I got called into Karl Rove's office. And so when this was, and was told, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm trying to show, or we are trying to show, that the loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States is not either directly dependent on trade with China or trade at all." And the response was, "Okay, so you're saying it's not China's fault? Then whose fault is it?" And so, it's so much easier to place the blame and place the onus on external actors.
Everybody wants a boogeyman, right?
And so we've created our own monster here because of political expediency, and it's tied us up in knots. And Congress is famously slow at everything, and I wouldn't hold your breath on a tax treaty getting passed. There are some that have been up there for 20 years without getting passed. But there are things that occasionally happen. But
Thanks, Charles. Is there a final question from the audience? I want to make sure you all have a chance to get your questions out if you do have any. All right. So we're in the middle of the silly season, right? Political season, midterms coming up. We haven't been able to really get anything done. Been so many great things discussed today and on this stage in the last 30 minutes or so. Is there any chance, any hope of any of it really getting done in a moment in time when there is so much division? And I know we've had other moments in time when there's been a lot of division, but this particular season seems to me, not only is there division, but there are people that are willing to literally say anything to get their point, to get their way. And most of the time it's without any basis in fact. So what do you think? Lydia, what do you, having just been in the den of iniquity?
Yeah, well, sitting in Jakarta, it looks crazy. I mean, that's just, it's very difficult for me to understand. And so I spent 1 week running around in DC talking to people to try and get a sense of that very question. And I'm not clear. I mean, it doesn't look good, I guess.
Steve, you guys have been doing the door knocks forever, and during the Obama administration, you I know personally worked so hard on TPP and trying to tell that story for years, and we got to where we are today with TPP. We don't have to rehash that. How are you feeling about the political process? The door knocks, you have to do it, but what are you feeling like what would that look like to you this year?
Well, there's the short game and the long game, and you can probably do a digital trade agreement that doesn't need any legislation. And if that means you can have a digital trade agreement that doesn't need Congress to sign off on, unlike CPTPP, which would need legislation. So we focus on what's achievable in the short term, which is a digital trade agreement, which doesn't need the Congress, depending on how it's written. And then, but we don't take our eye off the ball, as Adam mentioned, and we continue to say the CPTPP is in our national interest. We have to come back to it. In the meantime, let's get this digital trade agreement done because it can get signed and into effect without worrying about the politics on the Hill right now.
Ginny, what makes sense to you?
So I think maybe, and big maybe, we have learned something during the COVID years in terms of that there is such a thing as a supply chain, and it's not just between Mississippi, Maine, and California. Right now, the infant formula that's coming in is coming in from overseas. Now, I love how CNN just says overseas, like, it's not U.S., but doesn't tell us from where. But I think so. I think there's a little bit more public awareness that, products are moving from place to place and that's part of a successful supply chain. But I think it's good also that IPEF or APEC that's being hosted by the U.S. next year, none of these things have to go through Congress. And to the extent we can avoid making progress by not going to the U.S. Congress, the more likely it is we will have some breakthroughs. If we ask for something that requires Congress, now a tax agreement does, so that may be but at least we need an agreed tax treaty between the U.S. and Vietnam. Then we'll fight the congressional battle, but we don't even have the tax treaty yet. But I think that progress or standards or consensus can be worked on because of IPEF and because the U.S. is hosting APEC next year. We ought to keep on that path and just milk it for all it's worth.
Thanks. Charles, last word to you. You live it and breathe it every day in Washington, for better or for worse. What are you feeling about this particular year, the next 6 months or so?
I'm always super positive, and so I'm disheartened to hear that I was bearish. We're going to get this done. Okay, we're going to get a digital agreement done. Come hell or high water, we're going to get it done. The other stuff, I'm not so sure. Let me just answer your first question about resiliency. And my trouble with the word resiliency is it's sort of become like the word sustainability. It means all things to all people. And there are lots and lots and lots of niche agendas that are piling into this notion of resiliency in supply chains. And look, I'm a huge booster of a lot of, the Chamber is a huge booster of a lot of very important diversity and inclusion issues and all the rest of it. It's really hard, though, to kind of put all that stuff into a trade negotiation. And so I'm a little worried that these incredibly smart people in the administration are just a little too smart by half. I think, without dimming their ambition, I think they need to be focused and have their minds focused.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our session. Thanks for your attention today. Please, round of applause for Charles, Steve, Ginny, and Lydia.